Thank you very much. And this this conference is to talk about a piece of legislation that we're going to file, and just to talk about it somewhat generally. I think the text of the bill is there for anyone that needs it. You know, from the beginning of this year, it's been a process. The committee and its membership on the Democratic side made climate change a top priority for the Natural Resources Committee. And so over the last year, we've heard from scientists, advocates, indigenous communities and tribes, climate justice advocates, elected officials, youth leaders, community members about the consequences of doing nothing regarding our excessive carbon pollution and the need for Congress to take some action. Earlier this month, I had the opportunity to travel with Speaker Pelosi to Madrid for COP25, along with other House members, many of them from the Select Committee. And I think the main purpose of that was to reassure the world that, you know, we're still in it. And despite the lack of and the open opposition of the Trump administration to doing something about climate change on a worldwide basis, that we were still in it, and that many local communities, leaders, cities, towns, states, businesses were in it and trying urgently to meet this urgent need. And that was on the cusp of the report that came out, that even some of the predictions in Paris and leading up to this were dated, that the urgency had grown that much more, and that we had to take swift action, and we had to do it soon. And from that, the Speaker made it clear that each committee has an important role to play in developing legislation to address climate change. And so today, with the Vice Chair of the Resources Committee and Chair of the Public Lands Subcommittee, Ms. Holland, we're here to announce the legislation to share one part of the climate change solution. Oil, natural gas, coal extraction from public lands and waters contribute almost a quarter of our country's climate emissions. These fossil fuels worsen the extreme temperatures. We are realizing stronger storms and realizing rising sea levels, acidity, the warming of our oceans, and our bill, the American Public Lands, Waters Climate Solution Act, requires succinctly the Department of Interior and the U.S. Forest Service to manage our public lands to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. When the bill becomes law, new fossil fuel leasing on federal lands and waters will be halted for the minimum of 1 year. This gives our federal agencies time to assess how future leasing, how much of it, or if we have it, can be permitted responsibly in a way that's consistent with reaching a net zero climate emissions on public lands and waters by 2040. The bill sets intermediate targets along the way and requires Interior Department and the Forest Service to publish regular strategies explaining in detail how they will meet these targets. To solve our climate crisis, we need to attack this problem from two sides. On one hand, we need to ramp down existing fossil fuel production. The Trump administration is handing out drilling and coal mining visas like candy. And no thought is ever given by this administration for the climate change impacts. At the same time, we need to increase the amount of carbon our public lands absorb in our waters, conserve more of our natural landscapes, and expand the deployment of renewable energy on our public lands and waters. Our bill provides incentives with regard to both. If the departments fail to meet the emissions targets on the bill, they cannot lease more fossil fuel permits or hold new fossil fuel lease sales until they come into compliance. Of course, there are parts of the country that are currently economically tied to fossil fuel extraction from public lands and waters. Our bill helps these communities and the people impacted by this necessary transition by setting up a new transition assistance fund. Money for this fund would come from increasing the royalty rate on fossil fuel production. We also raise funds by establishing new fees on public land fossil fuel leases, fees that big oil and not taxpayers will have to cover. The intent here is not a self-fulfilling prophecy where we just create an incentive for more extraction. On the contrary, is to, and GAO said that within 10 years, that's over $1 billion and more, that I think is going to be needed in transition. One of the issues around climate change is this very critical point on how you move from where we are now to where we need to be. And that requires resources, that requires planning, and that requires money. The president's, and the money would be returned to impacted regions in the United States to be used for reclamation, restoration of land and water, retraining workers, and diversifying local economies. The president's energy plans have nothing to do with making America's life better. As we all know, it is about how much profits can be generated in extraction and for big oil. Our bill is about what's right for the whole country, not just polluting industries. And so my colleagues and I and the Natural Resources are committed to ensuring our public lands and waters are managed for the public's benefit. This means reducing the pollution that causes climate change. By transitioning away from coal, oil, gas extraction and making our public lands and waters pollution-free by 2040, we will add a major contribution to combat climate change, protect our current and future generations from the greatest consequential challenge and threats that we face, which is climate change. At the end of the speakers, we'll be glad to try to answer any of your questions. There's a lot of legislation that's going around, different dates, different times, different transitions. Well, we stuck within our jurisdiction as a Natural Resources Committee. We remained in our lane, and this is a significant number, 25%, both of the problem and of the solution. And this is an initial, significant first part of a comprehensive approach that Congress has to take. Responsibility as well, aligned with other committees as well. And that's what we're pushing. We heard those instructions from the speaker. This is the part we're doing. More to come. Individual members are going to be promoting complementary pieces of legislation dealing with production and dealing with other aspects of climate change within our jurisdiction that we welcome. We welcome the strong discussions that need to be had on, is it a 1 year, 2 year plus discussion? We welcome that to strengthen the legislation. We welcome the discussion about the controls on production and the lessening of that impact for the long haul. And that's the complementary legislation that particularly Mr. Lowenthal, I, and others are going to be working on to add to this. And we welcome the discussion about the feasibility of where this fits in a package of solutions and recommendations that the Select Committee will be providing to us. This is a step, a necessary step in our jurisdiction, a step that is not the cure-all, not the panacea, not the perfect, but a step that kind of break the logjam of moving an agenda forward to deal with a significant part of Congress's responsibility, which is public lands and waters. That's our offer into the discussion, and like I said, this is a flexible, open process, but we needed to file some legislation before the start of the rest of the session to broach the conversation and to be able to bring it to action in front of the committee down the road. With that, let me introduce my colleague and the valued leader of this Resources Committee and a voice that has been added very powerfully to the issues that we face, including climate change, as one of the priority issues of the public lands, the Vice Chair of the Natural Full Committee, Ms. Deb Howard.
Thank you so much, Chairman Grijalva, for your leadership on this and so many issues to ensuring our children and grandchildren have a planet in our future. Our communities deserve a federal government that puts our health and well-being first. The public lands continue to be a major source of carbon emissions that poison our air, land, and water. We're aiming for a renewable energy revolution while ensuring no community is left behind on the road to prosperity that a renewable energy economy will create. I'm proud to stand with leaders on the Natural Resources Committee to introduce a climate solution that is centered on climate justice and moving our country past fossil fuels that poison our earth. As chairwoman of the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands, one of the things that troubles me most is that public lands and waters are responsible for nearly 1/4 of the nation's carbon emissions every single year. The federal government should be leading the way in an effort to combat climate change, yet the lands we manage are some of the worst offenders. Earlier this year, several of us went to New Mexico for a field hearing, and we visited Chaco Canyon and surrounding sites. When we were there, we looked through infrared cameras to see poison coming out of drilling equipment and pipes. You could smell the methane. We experienced headaches from breathing it in and heard stories about how it affects the health of children who live nearby. All of this leakage is why New Mexico has an enormous methane cloud over the northwest corner of our entire state. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made it clear that we need to change course now and get to net zero carbon emissions across our economy by 2050. But what's more important is this bill focuses on our communities. It will provide financial assistance to workers like those in New Mexico that will be economically impacted by a transition away from fossil fuel extraction on public lands. Workers will be able to transition and retrain. Local economies will help diversify, and there will be funding to reclaim and restore land and water that has been affected by fossil fuel development. Our country can set the example for a renewable energy revolution by reducing emissions from public lands and helping our people and our planet to thrive. That's why I'm proud to be here today with my colleagues taking this important step to address climate change. Now I'd like to welcome Representative Mike Levin. Mike Levin isn't here. Okay. So I will. Yes. Jeremy? Okay. Wilderness Society. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Vice Chair Holland. It's truly an honor to be here. My name is Drew McConville. I'm the Senior Managing Director for Government Relations at the Wilderness Society. And since 1935, the Wilderness Society has worked to protect public lands from wilderness areas, forests, our wildlife refuges, our national parks. These are places that provide clean air that we breathe, the clean water that we drink, and recreational opportunities and connections that connect us from past to current to future generations, really. But still today, our public lands are not managed with any regard to climate change. And as a result, they are a leading driver of the crisis. So energy development on our public lands produces massive amount of greenhouse gas emissions, even if you're thinking globally. If U.S. public lands were their own nation, in fact, they would rank 5th in terms of emissions globally. Meanwhile, our public lands are at the front and center of impacts of climate change, as well as the communities that depend on them. So whether that's flooding, melting glaciers, melting permafrost, or catastrophic wildfire. And at a time when we desperately need to hit the brakes in the climate crisis, what is the Trump administration doing? They're slamming the gas. Our public lands have so much more to offer than yesterday's energy. Our public lands hold tremendous potential to store carbon, to responsibly host renewable energy, and to put people to work. It's time we realize the potential of our public lands to be part of the climate solution rather than part of the problem. And that's why it's so exciting to be talking about this bill today. This bill would finally require public lands to be managed with climate in mind. It would set binding targets and provide a range of management tools to ensure that our public lands and waters absorb more climate pollution than they are responsible for producing. This bill recognizes the role of natural solutions in storing carbon, in protecting biodiversity. This bill jumpstarts the transition from fossil fuel to clean, renewable energy. And this bill ensures that no community is left behind. And it does that by safeguarding disadvantaged and vulnerable communities and investing in transition, in an equitable transition. So again, I want to thank Chairman Grijalva, Vice Chair Holland, and everyone who's supporting this bill, and my colleagues, and just say that we, the Wilderness Society, our members and supporters, stand ready to help unlock the potential of our public lands to help solve the climate crisis. And with that, I want to introduce Chairman Bocino with the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you, Chairman Grijalva and Vice Chair Holland. There's plenty to do in your lane, and thank you for doing it. And thank you for your leadership, but also thank you to your staff for the hard work that they're doing day in and day out to put these issues out there and to get action to happen. So my name is Sharon Bocino. I direct the lands work at the Natural Resources Defense Council. From our oceans off Alaska to the Red Rock Canyons of Utah and the swamps of Florida, our public lands and waters are some of our nation's most priceless assets. Unfortunately, we've been subsidizing their destruction, as well as our own, by drilling and digging them up for oil, gas, and coal. The time has come for these lands and waters to be managed differently, and the committee's bill does that. The bill recognizes that energy development on public lands and waters should be guided by promoting a rapid, sustainable, just, and equitable transition to a clean energy economy. This is a future that we all, including our children, can get excited about. The bill provides a path to take us to this future. It requires a steady reduction in fossil fuel emissions from public lands and waters. And I'm a lawyer, and as a lawyer, I care about enforcement. This bill provides it. If emissions exceed the bill's targets, the Department of the Interior cannot issue new leases or permits to drill or dig. With this bill, we can manage our public lands and waters to solve, not fuel, the climate crisis. We can care for the earth, we can care for our children, we can care for our communities, we can care for our future. Thank you. And I'm going to now introduce my friend Aaron from Earthworks.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Aaron Mintzes. I'm with Earthworks. Our mission is to protect communities and the environment from the impacts of energy and mineral development while seeking sustainable, just, and equitable solutions. We are pleased to endorse today's legislation. We thank Mr. Grijalva and Ms. Holland and others. This bill will help transition our public lands more toward part of the climate solution and away from contributing to the problem. One such problem is the oil and gas expansion that's feeding the climate emergency unfolding right now, especially in the Texas and New Mexico Permian Basin and in the Four Corners region of New Mexico, elsewhere on our public lands along the Southwest. The oil and gas industry's methane pollution alone threatens to set back progress on climate around the world, which is why this bill directs our scientists and land managers to use the science-based decision-making to reduce oil and gas emissions from activities on public lands. And one necessary step is to pause new drilling on our public lands. The other important thing about this bill is that it strengthens the government's consultation role with environmental justice communities. The climate crisis impacts all of us. It disproportionately impacts communities of color. And our transition away from fossil fuels toward clean energy must be just equitable, and fair. That means oil and gas companies need to pay their fair share of those transition costs, including royalties, fees, and rents. And this bill will help raise a modest portion of the needed revenues for the just transition, and importantly, allow those communities most impacted to benefit. And so we're grateful to Mr. Grijalva, Ms. Holland, and others for their leadership on this bill, and both of whom have supported additional ideas that weave into the climate solutions fabric. Today's bill helps fit our public lands within that broader climate solution. Also part of that broader climate solution is my friend Marty Hayden, Vice President of Policy and Legislation with Earth Justice. Good morning.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Marty Hayden. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Legislation at Earth Justice, our nation's premier public interest environmental law organization. I am honored to be here to express our gratitude to Chairman Grijalva and Vice Chair Holland and all the co-sponsors of the American Public Lands and Waters Climate Solution Act. We are excited about what this bill represents. It's an opportunity to turn our public lands and waters into part of the climate solution instead of being a source of the climate crisis. The science is clear that time is limited to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, and that continuing to prioritize fossil fuel development on our public lands and waters will only hasten those impacts. The bill recognizes both the opportunity and the responsibility the federal government has to manage these areas in ways that increase their climate resilience, protecting human well-being, biodiversity, and our interconnected environment. If one listens to and learns from frontline communities, you know that the realities of a changing climate will negatively impact those already overburdened by pollution and other toxic environmental injustices, and who often have the least resources to respond to those insults. Earth Justice is appreciative that the bill reflects the chair's and the vice chair's long-standing commitment and attention to environmental justice communities through meaningful consultation and input in order to stop current, prevent future, and repair historic oppressions as we transition to a new, clean economy. While we know such transition must happen rapidly, Earth Justice commends the bill's commitment to the economic revitalization, assistance, and protections for those communities and workers currently dependent on the fossil fuel economy, to ensure that the transition happens as sustainably, justly, and equitably as possible. Thank you all again for your leadership. Earth Justice looks forward to working with all of you to pass this important legislation.
Thank you, thank you, Mark. We're available to answer questions individually, all the people that spoke, and be glad to take a couple right now, but I would encourage you that we have Ms. Holland and representatives of the organizations that spoke, that I think would be important and informative to also chat with them. But if you got any questions, easy ones, I'll be glad to take them. Yeah.
So does the bill address renewable royalty rates moving forward? And if not, are you concerned at all about lost revenue due to decreased production of oil and gas?
Okay, the first part I got. Give me the second part of the question.
So
My
presumably
concern.
the bill will decrease production. You have a moratorium, you have to hit emission targets, which in turn will decrease revenue, which goes to things like the LWCF and whatnot. So I'm just asking, are you concerned about revenue generation in the future?
you know, if you look at the legislation, the way we attack the issue is we attack the emission side of the issue frontally. I mean, we have to reduce emissions. And part of that is the production issue. I think it's the best way to answer the question, as we make a transition and our public lands become more of a natural source of a natural solution, that in some areas, and in particular in some of the extractive areas that we're talking about here today, production will go down. And I think I say that because that's the reality of legislation, that you cannot sustain a self-fulfilling prophecy where in order to make the necessary resource allocations, you have to ramp up production in the higher levels than it is already. No. So yeah, there's going to be a reduction, but I don't think, I'm not equating it in catastrophic states. In fact, we depend on some of the ongoing production that's grandfathered in, that already has legal rights to that, to be a source of revenue with increased royalties to help us make that transition. But inevitably, part of this lifetime and somebody else's lifetime, yeah, I mean, there's no other way around it. I think you replace that energy source and those jobs with renewables and alternatives, and that's why we have nothing in the legislation that lifts up those royalties in those areas. In fact, we want to incentivize those to be the replacement source going forward to some extent. Okay? Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, David McCombs with Argus Media. Can you explain a little better to me the 25% figure you were talking about regarding versus total emissions? These are what? Are you talking about life cycle emissions from oil, gas, coal produced on federal lands? Or what exactly?
Yeah, life
I didn't
cycle.
quite know that.
Yeah, they're life cycle emissions. Steve, you get all the technical.
Yes, it's the oil, gas, and coal extracted from public lands, and then when they're combusted downstream, that's the emissions that the U.S. Geological Survey looked at, and that's how they came up with that 23%.
So it's what, total emissions, total U.S. emissions then?
The percentage of total U.S. emissions.
Okay, well, everybody's available here. Thank you very much. Do you want to say anything before we close?
Well, thank you again, all of you, for coming. I just want to say, you know, going back to what I said in my earlier statement about us taking going to New Mexico for a field hearing and seeing all that methane leaking out of those pipes close to where people live, close to school buses driving by. And I just want to say that a lot of the gas and oil industry has not taken steps, even though the technology exists to make it a cleaner industry. They're not doing it. They're not doing it. It's cheaper to just let the methane pour out of the pipes into our atmosphere. So this is part of the cause for this 23% that we're talking about. And it needs to stop because our children's lives and their health is worth more than that. So that's, I just wanted to say that.
And a snapshot for us, the moment of the Trump administration and the rollbacks that they did in the regulatory sense, methane, that just made the problem worse. Power plant made the problem worse. And so the list goes on. So if we take the snapshot of where we are 3 years in, our public lands and waters have become bigger contributors to the problem than they were before. And so...
And Chairman, real quick, you had your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to see, I'm thinking Senator Bloomberg, how this fits in with the bigger goal of Democrats to work on the legislation next year.
There's a tentative date that I know of, which is March, where the Select Committee will be making recommendations to all various committees and jurisdiction, and almost every committee has something to do with the question that we're talking, whether it's transportation, defense, name it. And so there's not any committee that's exempt from having to come up with something. So they're going to make recommendations. What we are doing is as the resources committee, and having gone through all these hearings, is providing that committee and ourselves with what we believe is a template. And if the select committee has ideas that benefit and are perfecting to what we're doing, absolutely. But that's in March. We will, before that date, we'll be back here with you, Ms. Holland and I, to talk about the environmental justice bill that we'll also be submitting that deals with those frontline communities, vulnerable communities, indigenous communities throughout this country, and how that folds into the climate change discussion in a comprehensive way. This is our part, this is our lane, and
So could this bill potentially get rolled into that legislation that will arise out of the select committee report?
that's the hope. Well, they could, you have a lot of pieces of legislation going to 2050, 2040, 2030, 2050, 2060, different transition points. And I think the select committee is going to have its hands full trying to put together a bill that is both comprehensive, but also complies with the urgency that we're facing right now. And I think that's the biggest question.
Hi, Kelly Lenny from PA News. Sort of picking up on what you just said, is it possible that in the legislation, the timelines, the targets will become more aggressive
Yeah.
as it gets tweaked?
Yeah, I think, most of the legislation says 2050. When Palomas discussed 2050. McKeachin's bill is 2050. And 2040, because we felt that we had this 25% responsibility, that there was some urgency for us to set that date, and that in that period of time, kind of an in-between date between 2030 and 2050. But part of the reason for that selection is that I really think that that this bill, as I said earlier, if we're talking about a cause that is more than 1 year, all of us are open to that discussion. If we're talking about if we're talking about a discussion relative to what kind of, how we incentivize renewables and alternatives and make that part of it stronger, open to that as well. If we want to deal in a corollary piece, a complementary piece, a separate piece of legislation, because our discomfort was the legal side of going in and existing operations or existing claims and saying we're going to take them away from you. Deb and I don't have 25 trillion laying around to be able to purchase those rights. And so, and oil and gas are going to pump those costs up more than reality. But, so, this is our effort to try to do something that is potentially doable, that can be signed into law, and try to find that spot that makes it workable and that can get broad support. Can it be stronger? Are we open to that discussion? If those recommendations come from the select committee, if issues around production come from other pieces of legislation, of course we're open to it. Thank you.
Thank you.